Just a word of context here for this piece. I was struck a while ago by a remark by James Elkins, who's an art historian and teaches at the Art Institute in Chicago, who maintained that, you know, when we work on modernism, we write a lot of things that are very fine-grained and specific. We write on specific books, on motifs, on problems. And then we also speculate a lot on the highest level, which is about modernism itself. But Elkins maintains that there's a very vast territory in between the specific granular things that we often do, the historical studies, and then the largest concept of modernism. And I think that there are a lot of ideas in there that go into the composition of modernism that we take for granted, and we don't think about very much. Novelty, I think, was one of them, so I wrote a book about that. And the present, I think, is another one. I think it's a definite component of the overall idea of modernism, but we do tend to take it for granted. So I just finished a book about the present, and this piece is taken from the last chapter of that book. Modernism is inevitably identified with the present, to such an extent that Harry Haratunian has suggested presentism as a synonym for it. As Haratunian puts it, quote, "The presentism implicit in the modernist program proposed a progressive devaluation of the past and all that came before it to guarantee a definitive separation from the present's antecedents." Now, anyone with a minimal knowledge of modern literature and art will see this as a rash generalization, but it does at least raise a question about the terms being used. The notion that modernism was a single effort or something like a program depends to a great extent on the other term in the equation, the present. Modernism comes to be defined as the art of the present that is itself defined in very narrow terms as a time distinct from past and future. In the beginning, of course, modern simply meant the present. It was a deictic, a synonym for now. Even in its celebrated quarrel with the ancient, the modern was still a relative term, and thus it was capable of moving in time to keep up with the present. Sometime around 1927, though, with the publication of a survey of modernist poetry by Robert Graves, who are writing, the term modern lost its deictic quality, its relativity, and its freedom, and became attached to a particular stretch of years. Once it was provided at the beginning, whether this was identified with Baudelaire, Wilde, or Eliot, the modern also necessarily needed an end. And once it was defined by these, it could no longer function as a synonym for the contemporary. Thus, the rather odd situation in which the modern is no longer present, and the present is apparently no longer modern. Though the modern is absolutely identified with the present, its present is no longer the same as ours. However, these changes do not just happen to the modern, now converted to a period concept, but also to the later period concepts that follow. Thus, the widespread critical consternation about the term contemporary, which has become ubiquitous without acquiring any particular meaning. Critics such as Pamela Lee lament the creeping presentism of professional art history as it is practiced in the major universities, where contemporary art, until fairly recently ignored by serious scholars, has grown in influence until it threatens to displace interest in all previous periods. One of the main problems with this situation is that the contemporary is not a period in the accepted sense because it does not have any particular character. From this vantage point, it's possible to look back with some nostalgia on the postmodern as a time of purpose and certainty. Because the postmodern had a program in supplanting modernism and a list of definite characteristics which were frequently tabulated. Attempts to compile something like this for the contemporary, such as the celebrated October Questionnaire on the Contemporary, published in 2009, have been singularly unsuccessful. October cast a wide net, querying around 70 critics and curators, and got back almost as many different answers. Significant recent books by Terry Smith and Peter Osborne have proposed taxonomies of the contemporary based on actual works of art. But these attempts do not seem to have made much headway against the general undertow of anxiety and dissatisfaction. The peculiar features of the present as a period of time, the odd fact that it's always new and yet always the same, that it slips away instantaneously and yet is still right here, seem to have replaced the older features of a conventional time scheme of art, in which innovation moves on steadily, piling up achievements and advancing to some final goal. This is a situation that R. Vedanto famously called the end of the history of art. And it corresponds to a larger sense in society more generally, that the present is a guest that has come to stay. One of the classic features of the postmodern, according to David Harvey and Frederick Jameson, was, to quote, a dramatic and alarming shrinkage of existential time and the reduction to a present that hardly qualifies as such any longer. But that was some time ago. And since then, the postmodern has itself become outmoded, while the present remains, all the more powerful for the fact that it's become nameless. Attempts to name the contemporary are therefore attempts to tame it, to give it some quality other than its sheer naked presence. In his introduction to the October questionnaire, Al Foster frets that old paradigms like the avant-garde and the postmodern have run into the sand, and arguably, I'm quoting it from Foster, no models of much explanatory reach or intellectual force have risen in their stead. If recent history has taught us anything, though, it has taught us that any new model will also quickly run into the sand, so that the very search for new explanations is haunted by the anticipation of their inevitable demise. Giorgio Agamben has argued that the contemporary is always obscure to itself. And this is certainly the case, since understanding must always run a little after any experience. But right now, the contemporary seems to be caught in a situation in which the present is obscure to itself, but also at the same time all too clear, since its very presence has become familiar and repetitive. What's worse is that the practice of naming the present has itself become an old habit, outworn and ineffectual, and impossible to break. Surely one of the reasons that no new period term has arisen in this time of need is because of a jaded disgust with the awful necessity of yet another exercise in period branding. Debates about the contemporary are characterized by dissatisfaction with the sheer empiricism of now, but also by an anticipatory dread of the rapid rise and fall of the next postmodernism. This sense of being sentenced to the present has not been enlightened much by any very close examination of that slippery period of time. Now, by its very nature, seems to be simple and not complex, too obvious to need any explanation. Anxiety about the contemporary is shaped by a set of assumptions about the present, the relationship between the experiential present and the presence of art and society that rarely get enunciated or interrogated. There may be no way out of the impasse of the contemporary, but even negotiating our way within it will be less impossible if we had a clearer sense of what the present actually is. Much of the commentary on the contemporary tends to assume that history, the work of art, and human experience inhabit more or less the same kind of time, and thus can be synchronized in more or less the same present, prizing apart the historical present, the experiential present, and the present of the work of art, therefore, may be a first step toward a better understanding of how these work in both the periods, modern and contemporary, that have been named for the present. Haroutunian accuses modernism of stripping time down to a punctual present devoid of past or future. But he cannot really be serious about this, for the punctual present, otherwise known as the strict present, or sometimes the instant, has been since the beginning of Western philosophy one of the most basic paradoxes of time. It makes no sense to think of the present as a dimensionless divisor, because this suggests that time can be composed of units that themselves contain no time. But if the present does have some breadth, we then have to determine how much. And this is a task that has flummoxed philosophers from Aristotle to William James and beyond. As an alternative to this punctual present, Haroutunian advocates something he calls the historical present, by which he means a present common in history before the modern period, and also one that itself contains some history. But the term historical present is a paradox, a little like the term wooden iron that Husserl facetiously suggested as a name for his own model of a temporalized present. With this joke, Husserl was rather gamely admitting that he had never managed to explain how the present could contain some time and still remain the present, a problem to which he had applied a merely verbal solution. The term historical present suffers from the same defect, and simply raises all the basic questions about the punctual present in a different context. How can a period of time contain some history and still remain the present? Why should we use the term present at all for a time containing large admixtures of past and future? Since an historical present would have to contain tracts of time much longer than the mere seconds that concern Husserl, The challenges to it are especially grave. It's difficult to see how an historical present could achieve the temporal unity that we tend to think of as characteristic of the present in general. How is it possible to synchronize temporal events that are not punctual in nature? Must they start and stop at exactly the same time? Or can they be considered contemporary if some significant portion of their time spans overlap? On some level, we might consider Thomas Hardy and Philip Larkin to have been contemporaries because they were alive at the same time. But almost no one would consider this overlap between Hardy's dotage and Larkin's infancy to have been significant in any way. In addition to these temporal problems, there's also the problem of spatial contiguity. Does it make sense to speak of Hardy and Sun Yat-sen as contemporaries? They were alive at the same time, though their respective calendars were too far apart in many ways to be synchronized. These purely practical difficulties may not matter much, however, because Haratonian's favored alternative to the punctual present is not historical at all. In the end, it is the experiential present, which Haratonian understands as a constant in human history, that is his authoritative model of a more appropriate engagement with time. A similar model has been offered by a number of critics in the controversy over the contemporary, among them Peter Osborne, who favors what he calls the living present. Here Osborne follows a common trajectory, taking the phenomenological present as a basic structure that the historical present generalizes and complicates. From Aristotle on, sensory experience is seen to constitute the most basic kind of simultaneity there is. According to Aristotle, perception, almost by definition, occurs now. At one and the same time, we discern both white and sweet, and the differences between these two things. At one blow, as it were, the senses divide sensations into 5 types and recombine these into single experiences. In a way, it's a little too weak to say that the present is the time frame in which this happens, for Aristotle seems to argue that the fact that it happens is our best warrant for the existence of the present itself. The present, in a sense, is constituted by the synchronizing of our 5 senses into single experiences. Aristotle is thus the first to discuss what has become notorious in philosophy and psychology as the binding problem. Scientists in many fields would like to know just exactly how milk comes to be both white and sweet simultaneously and without division, though the two kinds of sense data are received by different sensors and carried via different pathways to different parts of the brain. All of this is complicated by the fact that even in the case of purely visual stimulus, different aspects of the input, such as shape and color, are processed at different rates. In fact, the convergence of all this data on a single point in time seems so fantastically difficult that a more parsimonious explanation has occurred to many scientists. It does not happen at all. Thus, the editors of a recent collection of articles on this issue sum up the findings of several of their contributors by saying, quote, "Just as there is no one place where it all comes together, there is no one time where cotemporal events are simultaneously represented," end quote. Present, in other words, is not the effect of a basic sensory simultaneity, but just an experiential assumption by which we compensate for the essential asynchronicity of our sense data. So much of the phenomenological research on temporal experience depends on the idea that sense data do come to be synchronized, that doubts about this basic fact of experience might threaten the whole project. As Ian Phillips puts it, quote, "Extant theories of temporal consciousness take the principle of simultaneous awareness as their point of departure. If we discard it, it's unclear why we need a philosophical theory of time consciousness at all." In fact, though, even the most famous phenomenologists have had similar doubts. Husserl himself was never satisfied with the account of temporal consciousness that has been so influential. And Paul Ricoeur's Time and Narrative, certainly the most prominent of all arguments on behalf of the living present, gets progressively more skeptical the longer it goes on. It ends with an almost despairing sense of, quote, "the ultimate unrepresentability of time," unquote. In particular, Ricoeur is skeptical about the idea that the living present can serve as a model for any more general synchronization of time. We just do not know enough about the experiential present for it to serve as a model for anything else. To some extent, though, the scientific facts do not matter. Because the version of the experiential present that's brought to bear in these discussions is very frankly normative and not descriptive. Thus Osborne claims that the phenomenological present is always threefold, but this is just preliminary to criticizing the contemporary present, because it's not. For Osborne, as for many others, the present we have right now is far too short, too much the present and too little the past and future. Some critics, like Richard Meyer, are more concerned that we've forgotten the past, others, like Marc Auger, that we no longer anticipate the future. In either case, the standard being applied is not the present as such, but the narrative present, the one in which the present is always half formed by imprints of the past and half by intimations of the future. The problem then with the contemporary is that it does not offer itself very easily to a clear narrative. Even some of the contributors to the October questionnaire, who might have been expected to know better, complained that the contemporary fails as a period because there is no way of narrating this era. At bottom, then, the experiential present is just a personalized version of the old historicist notion of perpetual progress, and complaints about the present couched in these terms are simply restatements of the original problem with the historicist model, which is that it did not accurately describe reality. There's actually very little reason for the presumptive authority of the narrative model, since it's not by any means the only version of the experiential present to be found in the past. Recent discussions of the contemporary seem to have forgotten the advice of Marcus Aurelius, probably the best-selling self-help author of all time, which is, quote, to separate from yourself the future and the past and apply yourself exclusively to living the life that you are living, that is to say, in the present, end quote. To achieve this peace of mind, Marcus suggests a spiritual exercise he called delimiting the present, one that was in use as late as Seneca, who maintained, quote, that the sage enjoys the present without depending on the future, end quote. It might be fair to say, in fact, that this purposeful ignorance of past and future has been far more consistently influential than the narrative model. The classic attitude itself, the calm self-sufficiency that the modern world found so intriguing in the ancient, is nothing more than this stoic belief in the sufficiency of the moment. For Goethe, in fact, the sickness of modernity began when it lost, quote, that splendid feeling of the present, end quote. That feeling of happiness and freedom is achieved when the present is liberated from past and future, and experience becomes unified in the moment. By many accounts, including that of Lukács, loss of this unity is the tragic fate of a modern world cut off from its ancient happiness. As Pierre Hadot has shown, the regimen that Marcus called delimiting the present was based on a particular understanding of experiential time. It would make no sense to try to limit experience to a dimensionless instant. When the Stoics and Epicureans recommended the present, therefore, they were defining this in linguistic terms. Aristotle and Augustine also noticed, a fairly obvious fact, that the word now is quite elastic in reference. It might mean an instant, it might mean a decade. On one hand, now seems to have a specific indexical purpose tied to the instant of utterance. On the other hand, it seems a kind of universal, applicable to an unlimited stretch of time. The Hellenistic Stoics resolved this difficulty by suggesting that the instant of utterance actually is universal. According to them, the present moment includes all the time there is, and thus it encompasses past and future without ceasing to be present. In comparison with a present this expansive, the narrative model, with its immediate linear connections to past and future, seems a feeble thing indeed. By some accounts, this ancient model of temporal experience is long lost now that we live in historical time. But the narrative model of the threefold present is not even the only one available in the modern period. Bergson is one obvious exception, and it may be that his philosophy has become so influential recently in the version offered by Deleuze because it proposes a version of the present that is not punctual or narrative, but vastly and generally inclusive. More recently, Paolo Virno has made a very similar argument in response to Bergson. To quote from Virno, total time, permanent and immutable, is the presupposition for any given now, the undatable premise for any given date, appearing as the already or before of each given act. According to Virno, in fact, the basic presupposition of the narrative model of the present, that cause should be linked in a linear relationship to effect, is wrong-headed. In language, which is Verneau's most persuasive example, the preceding coexists with the succeeding, as long coexists with parole. The virtual whole of linguistic possibilities is indeed the necessary precedent to any specific utterance, but it's not diminished when any of its possibilities are actualized, nor does it cease to be any less fully present than it was before. In language, at least, all the past usages and all the future possibilities are always there as the immediate context for anything said in the present. Whether any of these philosophies of the present are fully persuasive is not the point. Simply by existing, they refute some of the most deep-seated assumptions in the contemporary debate about the present and the present debate about the contemporary. It's taken for granted now that a life lived in the present is impoverished and even a bit perverted. This is not argued, but assumed, as if it were the wisdom of the ages. But the wisdom of the ages is often taught something quite different. At the same time, it's assumed that the only alternative to a life on the knife edge of time is a sort of triptych in which the present is flanked by its companions in past and future. History, ancient and modern, offers a number of other possibilities, some of which open out into a time far more expansive and less restrictive than the narrative model, ruled as it is by the law of cause and effect. It may be then that current dissatisfaction with the state of the contemporary is caused not by any actual defect, but by inappropriate expectations based on unnecessarily narrow notions of time. Similar expectations govern our notions about the present of the work of art. The common complaint that art is currently stuck in the present assumes a normative history in which art begins a narrative with the Renaissance and completes it with modernism, or perhaps with the end of it. Art, as distinct from the timeless realm of sacred images that came before, is narrative by definition, with an inherent determination toward the sort of perfect mimesis that was provided ironically by photography. Within the work of art itself, however, this descriptive imperative had a very different effect. The rather irregular point of view characteristic of sacred images came to be restricted to the single point in time and space dictated by the techniques of the perspective, and thus passing time was gradually drained away. Narrative had to be implied by all sorts of clever references because it could not exist within the picture frame itself. If the normative history is to be believed, then the narrative of art more or less required that the work of art release its claims to narrative time. The logical end of this story, as it is told by Clement Greenberg, is the complete evacuation of depth from the picture plane, lest it accidentally betray some tiny hints of time. If this narrative has come to an end, then, it is because its purpose was always to bring narrative itself to an end, to arrive at the point of utter stillness implied by the snapshot. It's not exactly the fault of the contemporary artists that this storyline, having come to its suicidal conclusion, left them nothing to do. However, this is not by any means the only way to understand the relation of art, works of art, and time. The classic text on this subject is certainly Lessing's Laocoon, which laid down a foundational distinction between the visual arts and truly temporal arts such as music. One way of stating Lessing's basic distinction would be to say that visual art sticks to the present, while music and literature may not stay there. But this is only partly true, even for extended works of literature, which do exist for readers in a kind of present, since every bit of the work is potentially available at any point in time. The simple fact that we may not read the end of Anna Karenina at the same time as we read the beginning does not really distinguish a novel from a painting, because in actual experience, we cannot see every inch of even the smallest painting at one glance. The eye does not scan smoothly, but works in fits and starts, called saccades, and these must be fit together somewhere in the brain. Painters seem always to have known this, which is why the most successful works are so artfully composed. Does this mean then, despite Lessing's assurance that any work of any kind of art must exist equally in time and in some kind of present? George Kugler says something like this in relation to the whole of art, which he describes as a series of signals from then to now. In Kugler's strikingly modern metaphor, quote, "The present instant is the plane upon which the signals of all being are projected." The present, in other words, is a one-dimensional medium on whose infinite thinness the whole of the past depends for its existence. Since the past is flattened out against the membrane of the present, there's no question of narrative or even of sequence. All thens are potentially equidistant to one another in the context of the single now. One advantage to this metaphor, so different from the narrative arc of conventional art history, is that it can also be used to describe individual works of art. In fact, Alexander Nagel and Christopher Wood seem implicitly echo Kubler when they call the work of art, quote, a message whose sender and destination are constantly shifting, end quote. For Nagel and Wood, then, the work of art is a strange kind of event whose relation to time is plural. Their book on this topic is called Anachronic Renaissance, but the implication is that all art is anachronic, a coinage that is meant to avoid the normative judgment contained in the idea of anachronism. The individual work, then, is also a screen with all the time before it projected on a single dimension. What sort of dimension is it, though, in which the past comes to deposit itself? One model might be offered by the ancient understanding of aesthetic experience, which both Plato and Aristotle taught occurs entirely in the present. According to Plato, any kind of pleasure is, quote, unlimited and belongs to the kind that does not and never will contain within itself and derive from itself either beginning, middle, or end. This is perhaps the earliest version of the idea pursued so fervently in the recent works of Jameson, that affect is intrinsically at odds with narrative time. For Aristotle as well, pleasure, like sensation, is, quote, at any moment complete, for it does not lack anything which coming into being later will complete its form, end quote. What is true of sensation in general is certainly true of aesthetic experience, which is commonly constituted by the co-presence of different perceptions, color and shape, for example, in a single sensation. Such sensations are not limited to the present, but their singularity is one of the defining features of the present as such. It's not too far from this descriptive account to a normative ideal in which the perfect convergence of perceptions in the present is the feature that makes aesthetic experience the finest kind of experience in general. The Peripatetic, the Epicurean, and Neoplatonic schools, despite their various differences, all agree that aesthetic pleasure was the highest kind, corresponding to the richest possible grasp of a moment. The intrinsic identity of pleasure with that grasp of the moment then became a conscious ideal, as if it were not an inevitable fact of experience. Beauty was to be apprehended all at once, not just in a moment, but even in an instant. And the brevity of the present ceased to be a problem as it became an index of a very particular kind of pleasurable certainty. The obvious fact that we must encounter any work of art, novel as much as photograph, in the present, thus becomes a measure of art's particular excellence as experience. This did mean, though, that the binding problem, a nagging question as to how the different sensations are to be combined, reappeared as a threat within aesthetic history, aesthetic theory. Aristotle worried about this early on, and in worrying about it, he produced yet another set of questions about the extent of the present. Very small things, he said, cannot be beautiful, because our apprehension of them approaches zero in terms of time, while very large ones cannot be beautiful, because we cannot see them in their entirety all at once. Aristotle arrived at the same solution to this problem as Goldilocks, with a successful work of art installed firmly in the happy middle. But he also has recourse to another solution common in the ancient world, synthesis. The beauty of synthesis as a workshop guide and an aesthetic ideal is that it inserts into the work something that can be apprehended all at once, no matter how large and various the work may be. Synthesis, in other words, reimagines the work as a unified whole, so that it can be experienced in a single moment of time, while its parts remain as disparate in time and space as ever. The binding problem is not so much solved as delicately sidestepped, and the work of art comes down to posterity in two forms, one material and the other ideal. The present inhabited by a work of art is therefore a highly complex one. Even as a purely material artifact, a work of art intersects with time in a number of different ways. Art exists most simply in immediate terms, is what Jacques Rancière calls the senseless naked presence of the material substrate. The stone, the paint, the print are there, first of all, in a pure present, static marks on page, paintless splashed on a wall. For all but the very newest artworks, though, that presence has a curious quality, so solid in the now, and yet redolent of some stretch of the past. Hubler claims this is true of all objects, which have a specific kind of duration, quote, so durable that they antedate every living creature on Earth, so indestructible that their survival may, for all we know, ultimately approach infinity, end quote. Exaggerated though it may be, this idea does suggest the way in which artworks may occupy a kind of eternal present tense, even as mere objects, quite regardless of any content. In addition, an image, simply as an image, carries forward into time a present that refuses change, that exists in every subsequent now as long as it exists. As Nagel and Wood put it, quote, the spatial presence of the image reads as a temporal present tense, unquote. This present is a curious one because it lasts essentially without limit. The present of the work of art is therefore double in two different ways. It brings together then and now in an apparent unity, and it mingles the immediate with duration. Thus, the peculiar kind of presence confronted in a work of art, which is all the more striking, more present as it were, the more it incorporates some sense of distance. Perhaps the oldest version of this particular kind of wonder is the ancient feeling in paintings of some kind of miracle, fixed in a prior time and place, and yet alive right now. More recently, Rancière and Georges Didi Huberman have both called this quality co-presence, to indicate the way in which the striking immediacy of the work of art depends to some extent on another presence, distant in time, within it. And Didi Huberman has influentially juxtaposed this kind of coexistence across time to the narrative disposition offered by conventional art history. If the merely material part of a work of art can have such a complex relation to the present, then it seems likely that the situation of its immaterial counterpart may be almost bewildering. For Plato, this situation was relatively simple. Though the material substrate of the work of art exists in time, the ideal pattern represented there is timeless. In the millennium of religious art that preceded the Renaissance, the place of that ideal pattern was taken by God, who also inhabits a timeless realm. As an image, the icon exists in the same kind of time, a kind of eternal present for which every moment of time is equally close. But the purpose of the icon is not to displace the viewer into that timeless realm. On the contrary, it exists in order to bring an eternal presence into the present. The icon, as a physical object, was thought to be identical to the sacred personage it represented, which is why it was able to perform the same kind of miracles. Thus, according to Didi Huberman, it would be wrong to say that the icon represents. Its purpose is to make present. It exists in order to create a connection between two different modes of the present, the eternal present of God and the immediate present of the immortal observer. This remains true even as the focus of art turns to more practical images of the here and now. From the archaic to the classical, Greek art became less hieratic and more immediately descriptive. But the purpose of its statues of athletes and soldiers was still to evoke typical emotions and situations. These types were different in kind from the eternal Platonic patterns, but they were timeless nonetheless. As the Renaissance replaced the staring icons of the past with new renditions of living people in actual temporal situations, the regime of perspective still linked the everyday to a kind of truth independent of specific places and times. In a sense, the underlying geometry was even more rigid than the purely frontal address of the icons. The idea behind the regime of perspective, the idea of art itself, comes to play much the same role in Renaissance art that God had played before. As Hans Belting puts it, quote, the new presence of the work succeeds the former presence of the sacred in the work. But what could this presence mean? It's the presence of an idea that's made visible in the work, the idea of art as the artist had it in mind. End quote. According to Rancière, much the same situation obtains in the era of aesthetic realism. In this case, the atemporal idea is that of freedom, which Ringelmann had derived from his examinations of ancient art. The freedom from time and care that he imagined there, a freedom that actually existed only insofar as these remnants of art had been removed from their original contexts, appears in modern instances such as Dutch painting or the novels of Stendhal as the counterpart of a certain kind of purely realistic detail. The independence of the detail from any larger structure, which makes it seem realistic and not ideal, comes to stand for the very particular ideal of individual independence from obligation and responsibility. Thus, the most practical and immediate description, bound to the sheer present of the immediate moment, also stands as an instance of timeless enjoyment. I'm quoting from Rancière, thinking of nothing except the present moment, enjoying nothing other than the pure feeling of existence. End quote. This is the same present discussed recently in more somber tones by Jameson. In his account, the perpetual present of the canvas of a painter like Rubens, insofar as it focuses the viewer on the pure experience of shape, color, and texture, achieves a new kind of aesthetic autonomy, which in turn stands for a kind of eternal present, independent of narrative and of false responsibilities. Told in this way, the story of art's history comes to seem less a narrative and more a steady, variable convergence of two modes of the present, the immediate and the eternal. It's perhaps something like this that Kubo had in mind when he imagined all the past projected on the screen of the present. Verno suggested something similar, except in this case the past is not projected on the present, so much as the present is constantly sampled from the past. In either case, the crucial relation is not between then and now, but rather between now and always. The immediate present indicated in the work of art, the gesture, the look, the drape, the color, fabric, or hair, exists in a state of co-presence with something perpetual, timeless forms, ideal presences, the idea of freedom. For many in the modernist period as well, the linear connection of the present to the past and future around it is superseded by a connection between the immediate present, now, and some form of perpetual present, always. One of the more vivid examples of this relation is Le Corbusier's Towards New Architecture, in which the newest kinds of automobile parts are displayed alongside Greek and Egyptian monuments, as if these latter had been reincarnated in the shops of Fiat or Daimler. Le Corbusier is not really proposing a circular version of time in his manifesto, for the monuments of the past were themselves historical versions of the timeless Platonic solids, which are still fresh in the 1920s because they had always been there, just as new as ever. Corbusier represents a significant branch of modernism whose purpose was to show within the historical present of the early 20th century another, more durable present that had been obscured by the immediate past. It's a simple matter to find similar examples in literature. Kenneth Hamburger suggested some time ago that the interior time of a modernist novel actually resembles the epic present. Gerard Genette has made the same point in general and about Proust in particular. The way that Proust's narrator returns over and over to the same feelings, episodes, and topics suggests that they are just as durable and unchanging as Francois, the family servant, who's a reliable touchstone in opinions and behavior. The whole structure of involuntary memory implies that nothing is lost, that the whole of time exists within us in a single state, such that some experience from what seems the past can surge forth and reveal its enduring presence. This is a positive version of the kind of thing that occurs more negatively in The Wasteland, where Tiresias is condemned to remember and then to reenact everything that has ever happened. In fact, this habit of referring to now to some eternal present is so pervasive in modernist literature that it was once responsible for the doctrine of spatial form, an earlier version of the idea that modernism is a kind of presentism. But the present evoked in this case is neither private nor restricted. Frank Kermode suggested some time ago that spatial form is just a figure for the item, the ancient order of time in which Platonic ideas and angels were supposed to reside. The Eivum, in other words, is another name for the perpetual present of classical and iconic art. And the sense of Kermode's analysis is that this mode of the present persisted into the modern period to exist there, forming the same sort of counterpoint to the immediate present that it had in earlier times. The relation between these modes of the present is not temporal, but figurative, in part because the perpetual present is not a part of actual time, not tradition or the classic, but a totality composed of all the possibilities that can be effective in time. In this sense, the relation that Kermode describes resembles the dialectical image as defined by Walter Benjamin, and now, as Benjamin puts it, charged to the bursting point of time. It might seem hardest of all to find some version of this situation in music, but this is just what Jameson does in his recent analyses of Wagner and Mahler. To the objection that it's scarcely possible to conceive of some pure present in a temporal art like music, he responds by calling attention to, quote, the timbre and color of the musical event, to the body of its instrumentation, to the peculiarity of the sound combinations, which is bound to shift the experience of sound away from its moment in time and far more decisively to the approach of some paradoxical new musical atemporality, end quote. In other words, the focus of attention on the pure materiality of sound, separate from melody or musical program, brings to the fore a kind of present that in Jameson's two examples at least has immediate reference to a vast whole composed of all the musical qualities that make the moment possible. In the case of Mahler, Jameson calls this, quote, a present in which there is for the moment everything, the whole system, except that like the present, it is in constant motion, end quote. Not an image then, but what Jameson calls a musical event, charged to the bursting point with time. To judge from certain recent works, this version of the present is also to be found in contemporary art. The photography of Hiroshi Sugimoto, for example, involves a purposeful expansion of the time frame of the instantaneous snapshot. In one project, Sugimoto records the full duration of a film shown in a classic 1970s theater, combining every frame in one still image, so that the screen becomes a soft, luminous rectangle floating in the dark. A whole narrative, in other words, comes to be present in one instant of time. As Lutz Kepnick puts it, quote, Sugimoto pictures the presence of a past as one extended now, in whose space we can enjoy the pleasures of losing our normal temporal being, quote. Among Kepnick's other examples of this effect are the glacier photographs of Nina Subin, Olafur Eliasson. Since a glacier is, in a sense, flux frozen in time, photographs of these can be seen as affording, in Kepnick's words, a timeless present existing in a state of suspension. Of course, a great deal depends on whether we see such examples as representative or exceptional, and Kepnick tends to see them as part of a countercurrent to the otherwise dominant trend of the contemporary art world. But it's also true, as he argues, that the most common forms of contemporary art, including installation and video art, tend by nature to probe, quote, the temporality of producing and attending presentness, end quote, to explore the nature of the present rather than taking it for granted. Taking our cue from the work of art itself, then, we might imagine a present quite different from the one that haunts discussions of the modern and the contemporary. Much of our distress over these terms begins with the assumption that there's only one alternative to an arbitrarily limited present, and that's the present centered in some narrative. In fact, the real effect of this alternative is to submerge the present altogether in the flow of narrative. And this is why it's generally advocated by critics who abhor a concentration on the present in any form. History and theory both offer other, more satisfactory alternatives, ones that seem to match the facts of artistic practice more accurately. Looked at from this perspective, it's the narrative model that is the recent arrival, as the threefold version of the experiential present seems a relatively new theory that may already have been superseded. As contemporary artist Perry Dodge puts it, quote, humans need an architecture that pushes later away from now. But the truth is, everything is next to itself and is happening at once, end quote. From this point of view, our concentration on the present from the modern to the contemporary does not seem a problem at all.